Next, I want to welcome Marius Sandbu to the CUGC webinar stage. Marius is a leader of the CUGC networking SIG and a CTP, and I went in to look at all of his accolades, and the list was very long, so I shortened it quite a bit. But before I hand things over to Marius, I want to let you know who's moderating for this session. We have Esther Barthel. She is a CTP. She is a CUGC Women in Tech mentor. She's a member of our content working group, and she is with us, and also joining us, although I think he might be stuck at a customer site, so he might be a few minutes late, is Samuel Legrand. He's a CTP. He's a leader of the France CUGC group. So hopefully he'll make an appearance, but I do know that we still have DJ with us. So if Esther's Wi-Fi goes out, we have DJ to help with the questions. So without wasting any more of you guys' time, I'm going to hand things over to Marius right now to get us started. And Marius, I'm sending you the screen right now.
So hopefully everybody can see my slides as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So let's get the show on the road. And as Stephanie said, I'm going to be talking about running Citrix now after the renaming. It's called Virtual Labs and Virtual Desktops, using it in a public cloud setting. So might be repeating a little bit about Mike and Ron has been talking about earlier, but a little bit, maybe a little bit more detail on Google Cloud and from an Amazon perspective, because it's more about how we can deliver Citrix on Azure and Amazon and Google, what kind of functionality is supported and so on. But I'm jumping ahead of myself, so just want to do a little bit more introductions about myself. I work as a technical cloud lead at a company called Every, which is based out of Norway. And I focus mostly on public cloud related projects. So I've been working most of my late career on Microsoft Azure, but last couple of years it's been more Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services as well. And I try as much as possible to work on any type of DevOps related projects because I see that's an interesting way we're moving forward. I also do a lot of blogging on my spare time. And if you have any questions after the webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to me either on Twitter or send me an email. I'm also part of a lot of different communities. I'm a part of the CTP program, the Microsoft MVP, and so on. This tells you more about my lack of social life than anything else. But I like to spend a lot of time in community and doing webinars such as this. What am I going to be talking about for the next 55 minutes or so? I'm just going to be starting to talk a little bit about public cloud. Most of you already have quite familiar with functionalities and properties that it has, but there have been some changes recently. And of course, that's one of the interesting things with working with public cloud. It's if something new or new functionality, new service that's released almost every day. And that's why I needed to make some changes to this slide deck 5 minutes before I went on, because there were some new announcements and new functionality. And of course, I'm going to talk a little bit overview of the landscape, so how the different vendors compare and what the analysts say and so on. And then I'll do a little bit introduction into Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services. Mike and Ron have been talking a bit about Microsoft already, so I'm not going to be spending too much time on that. And also talking a little bit or comparing the different vendors, because I see public cloud kind of like cars. Every cloud provider gets you from A to B, but once you go a little bit in depth into each provider, there's a lot of small differences that you might notice. So a little bit deep dive into that, and then I'll head on over to talking about running Citrix in public cloud, what kind of feature and functionality supported, and what kind of cloud-based architecture that we can use, and also summarize a little bit what kind of considerations that you need to think out before you start on a public cloud project when you want to deploy Citrix and something else. So what's happened in cloud the last couple of weeks? And as I said earlier, this is one of the fun things with public cloud and why I needed to make some changes. And I want to point out a small error on Mike's presentation, because he said that Microsoft has 50 regions now, but actually they announced a couple of days ago that they're opening 2 new regions in Norway next year. So this is going to make a lot of things easier for us here in small parts of Norway. And also, this announcement came only, well, 2 days after Google opened up their region in Finland. So they opened up an entirely new region there. And also Amazon Web Services is now opening a data center in Sweden as well. So there's a lot of changes going on, but this is just 2 of the big announcements that has happened over the last couple of weeks. We also have a bunch of other functionalities and services that was released just during the course of this last week. We haven't gotten to the big IT conferences yet, so I'm guessing there's a lot more to come during the course of the next 6 months. But of course, this also makes it hard to follow up what's the latest feature, what's the latest functionality, and what kind of considerations do I need to make when I'm actually starting my cloud journey or cloud project. So as I said about the properties of public cloud, one of the benefits that we gain as a customer or partner using public cloud, especially on the automation piece, because Mike talked a little bit about using ARM templates to actually do deployment of full infrastructure. And this is also something that's also part of the foundation on both Amazon and Google as well. So they have an automation layer that we can use to deploy infrastructure using infrastructure as code. Or we can use any type of open source based tools such as Terraform. We can use Packer to deploy images. I'll come back to that a little bit later. We also have Ansible, or we can use the native built-in tools as well. Of course, the billing perspective is that we can only pay for what we use, and all the 3 vendors, so Amazon, Google, and Azure, is now billing per second for infrastructure as a service. This is some changes that was made a couple of months ago. So Amazon started, and then Google followed, and then Microsoft came a couple of weeks later and changed their billing subscription as well. So there's a lot of competition here. And for platform as a service, typically billed per consumption based upon either throughput or storage usage and so on. Of course, self-service capabilities means I can simply go inside a portal and start setting up new services, just filling out some information and adding a credit card, as simple as that. Of course, we get the scalability in the picture. We can easily get access to specific virtual machine infrastructure with specific hardware, such as GPUs or RDMA-based backbones. And last week, a couple of weeks ago at the SAP conference, Microsoft and Amazon announced that we'll be releasing virtual machines with 12 terabytes of memory, which is then available through a self-service portal. And it's, of course, the elasticity, meaning that we can scale up and down, both in the amount of instances, but also what kind of instance type we want. And this can be either based upon a schedule or on demand, either for services themselves or pure infrastructure. So all these properties are something that we can make use of when we're actually building up a Citrix environment in the public cloud. So when it comes to the landscape, so this is the infrastructure quadrant released from Gartner a couple of months ago. This hasn't changed that much. Of course, there have some providers that have been removed from the quadrant, but it's still the same when it comes to the market leaders. It's still Amazon Web Services, which now is still the market leader. We have Microsoft a little bit behind, and then we have Google as the on third place. And of course, if we look at the platform as a service landscape, from a market share, it's pretty much the same. We have Amazon, we have Microsoft, and we have Google. Now, Microsoft and Google also focuses a lot on the collaboration sides of things. So Microsoft has Office 365, Windows 10, EMS ecosystem, and Google has Google G Suite and Chromebooks as part of their ecosystem as an alternative. While Amazon, on the other hand, haven't had that focus yet, but they're actually starting to make more collaboration-based tools as well, and now with Alexa for Business as well being part of that. I'm guessing there's going to be more focus on that moving forward to actually start grabbing more of the enterprises. So I'm just going to start a little bit of an introduction to Google Cloud. So as a Microsoft MVP, I've been working a lot with Microsoft Azure for the last years. But I started working on Google Cloud, and I must say I've become a huge fan of their platform. You can compare it to their search engine. It's simple and it's fast. And when it comes to like deploying virtual machines, they are by far the fastest cloud provider when just to spin up virtual instances. Now, Google Cloud is now available in 16 regions worldwide, and each region is then split up into multiple data centers, which is then contained within something called availability zone. And this is something that you can compare with Amazon's setup, because they have the same set of region-wide, and then you have availability zones. And of course, you have one of the strengths of Google Cloud is that you can customize virtual machines. So instead of saying that I want a specific instance type, I can say that I want 2 CPUs, 16 gigs of memory. I can also specify what kind of CPU chipset I want to use, if I want to have Skylake or Broadwell. And I can also specify if I want to have a specific SSD type, or if I want to have GPU as part of it as well. So this is one of the strengths that Google Cloud has. Now, Google is running a KVM-based hypervisor underneath. So it's pretty fast, and they do a lot of, they've been focusing a lot on the core infrastructure things to make it scalable and deliver quite good performance. And also, well, I've also said that it's the cheapest option in certain areas. I'll come back to that a little bit later, because I have an example I want to highlight. From a strategy and roadmap perspective, so Google has been focusing quite a lot on DevOps, because that's where their core business lies. And from a hybrid perspective, so Google doesn't have like the legacy footprint that Microsoft has with Windows Server and so on, the same with Amazon, but they actually announced a partnership with Nutanix earlier this year or last year. So it's going to be interesting to see how that fits into their business model moving forward, and if it can be a competition to what Microsoft has with Azure Stack, or what Amazon has with VMware. So Google Cloud's automation layer is something called Google Cloud Deployment Manager. It's based upon the YAML syntax. So if you've been working with Netscaler Mass, you know you have something called stylebooks there, which also uses the same type of syntax. So which means that we can deploy infrastructure or any type of service in Google Cloud using that type of code. Identity and role-based access control in Google Cloud is based upon the Google identity. So if someone has Google G Suite previously and has a synchronized identity set up, they can reuse those identities to access Google Cloud instead of role-based access control there. So Google Cloud has a structure where you have something on you have an organization, which is the top level, which is the root level. And then you have different projects underneath where you place your resources. So a virtual machine needs to be placed within a project, and a project needs to be placed within an organization level. From a networking perspective, networks are mostly or can be contained within a specific region, but we have something called VPC, so Virtual Private Cloud. And when you set it up, it by default set up a global spanning virtual network, which goes across all the different Google regions. But of course can be changed if required. So this is just the simplest example architecture I could find on Google Cloud. As I said, it uses availability zones. If you want to deploy a highly available service like Active Directory, we need to place 2 instances within a separate zone. But of course, and then also as part of that, when we have different zones, we also have different subnets. So that's something to keep in mind when you want to deploy high available services within Google Cloud. So when it comes to AWS, pretty much the same setup from an architectural perspective. They have 17 regions worldwide. Of course, they are the market leader and have a lot of the huge customers such as Netflix running on AWS. Of course, they have multiple availability zones within each of the regions that they have. So most of them have 3 or more availability zones. And Amazon has been, up until now, using a send-based hypervisor. But I think it was 2 months ago, they actually announced that they will be moving towards KVM-based hypervisor. And already for some instance types that you have in AWS, it's already been converted to KVM. And of course, I'll come back to that a little bit later, but AWS has a huge service catalog of platform services that neither Google or Microsoft has. And of course, AWS, it's important for them to be focusing on the DevOps community and adding services functionality there. But they also entered a partnership with VMware to deliver VMware Virtualization on AWS bare metal servers. So you get a VMware virtual environment running on bare metal AWS servers, and you get the virtualized infrastructure then managed from VMware itself. This is now already being available in many of the AWS service regions worldwide. But I'll get back to that a little bit later from a Citrix perspective. Now, from an automation level, CloudFormation is the automation layer that they have. So you can either use YAML or JSON-based syntax to do the deployment. From a role-based access control perspective, we have something called AVS Identity, which allows us to easily create different roles and what kind of functionality and services that specific users should have access to inside the cloud platform. Of course, resources are based within region. We can also group resources within something called a resource group. It's not the same type of abstract that Microsoft uses resource groups for. It's just basically a view or role-based access control type. It's not used for lifecycle deployment. And again, Amazon has a VPC where you set up your virtual network and you deploy virtual machines as part of it. And of course, a VPC network is contained within a region, but we can also set up something called VNet or VPC peering to bridge communication between multiple virtual networks if we want to. Like Google, we have availability zones. If we want to deploy a highly available service, we need to deploy a single instance within each availability zone. And as also mentioned earlier, we have different load balancing mechanisms that we can use to load balance traffic across different availability zones. And also for virtual machines without a public IP address to be able to communicate out to the outside world, we need to have a router or a NAT appliance which runs also within the same availability zone to allow communications outbound. So this is the same setup for Google and Amazon, while Microsoft doesn't have that requirement if you want to have communications outbound. So Microsoft, from a region perspective, has the most regions available. They also have availability zones, but it's still in preview, so they are getting there to the same steps that Amazon and Google has. Microsoft is, of course, basing their underlying hypervisor on similar to something called Hyper-V, or similar to Hyper-V. They call it Red Dog. And Microsoft, from a software perspective, has a lot of integrations with on-prem workloads. So you have Azure Identity, you have File Sync, you have SQL. So there's a lot of built-in features there that we can use to do migration and so on. That's one of the core strengths that Microsoft has. And of course, from a strategy roadmap perspective, of course, the end user computing space, so with typically Office 365, Windows 10 EMS is a big bet for Microsoft. And they also do a lot of work on the Azure stack, which is kind of like the Azure Lite edition that you can have within your own data center. And also Microsoft announced a couple of months ago that they will also be coming with VMware support on top of Microsoft Azure. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works out for them. Now, this is a little bit of repetition of what Mike mentioned, but you have automation layer, which is based upon Azure Resource Manager. You have JSON syntax, and of course you have a lot of different instance types, which I'll come back to a little bit later, depending on what type of disk, if you want to have GPU or not, if you need to have RDMA-based backbone and so on. Of course, all resources in Azure needs to be deployed within the resource group, and you need to have that resource group within an Azure subscription. And of course, you can have multiple resource groups within a subscription. But a resource needs to be a part of a resource group. Of course, networking is isolated within a region, but again, we have VNet peering now as GA a couple of weeks ago, which allows us to cross-communicate between virtual VNets inside of Azure. Now, from a redundancy availability perspective in Azure, we need to use something called availability sets, which Mike talked about earlier. I'm guessing this is going to be replaced mostly with availability zones moving forward, because it's going to be providing a lot higher level of SLA than availability sets can. And of course, we have the different subnets where we have network security groups, which actually used to set up firewall rules of communication across different subnets. So now when we've been doing a lot of these different projects to move services and applications out to public cloud, there's a lot of things that we need to plan in front before we start doing these type of projects. So first off is that when you start, you need to check that the provider or the cloud platform you want to use actually has support for that type of workload you want to move out. So when you're using or moving Citrix out, you might also have different other applications and services that need to be set up. So one of the things we found out, for instance, is that Oracle, from a licensing perspective, is not permitted to run on Google Cloud. And it might also be other types of services, such as SAP might not be certified to run a specific cloud provider. So that's something that you need to figure out. But it might also be other types of services or applications. And of course, you need to check that if you want to choose, if you've chosen a region where you want to deploy the infrastructure because it's closest to end users, and then you figure out when you start deploying that, okay, that specific instance type that I wanted to have, which has GPU support, is not available there. And this is going to differ from region and also from different cloud providers, what the availability is. And this is may be because of the generation type of data center that the cloud provider has in that specific region. But all vendors provide a list of regions and list of services that are available on that specific region. So be sure to check that out. And of course, as also mentioned, when it comes to subscription quota, because one of the things that I encountered a couple of weeks ago when I was doing some project in one of Microsoft's data centers, that I started to expand the subscription quota that I had, but then I got feedback from Microsoft saying that we are actually out of capacity and we needed to wait 1 month before we got more CPU cores available in that specific region. So that's always something to start on, so the project doesn't stop before it's actually started. And when you're doing or building that infrastructure in public cloud, so instead of going in the portal and clicking on the different services you want, try to use infrastructure as code as much as possible, because it's going to make things a lot easier when you're doing changes. Of course, you can use the native providers, but from my experience, I'm seeing that Terraform is a lot simpler tool to adopt, and it also supports supports even Google, Amazon, and Azure from the same tool. And it's a lot easier to read from a coding perspective. And of course, you can use the pay-as-you-go model, then you get billed per second. But of course, all different cloud providers have allows us to reserve capacity upfront, and then we get infrastructure at a lower cost. So also try to combine these different these different types of billing, because it can also allow us to save a lot of money, because we'll always have like Active Directory running as a service, which needs to be run 24/7. So then we can use the reserve capacity to lower that specific cost. Of course, as Mike mentioned a little bit about finding the closest regions, I didn't know about the Cloud Harmony URL, so that was a good tip. I'll add that to the slide deck, mine as well. But of course, pretty much the same, how to measure the latency to the different regions worldwide when it comes to storage, platform services, and infrastructure as well. Of course, once you're deploying infrastructure in public cloud, most of them get a public IP address that you can use to start managing the virtual machine straight away. And of course, for Windows, you get RDP. For Linux, you get SSH. And of course, all these public IP ranges are publicly available for download from different vendors, because they want to make it easy for customers to open their firewall or allow firewall traffic or allow network traffic to flow out. But it also makes it attractive for botnets and scanners and so on. So we had a couple of virtual machines deployed in Azure for a duration of 5 hours. We had about 1,700 failed authentication attempts on those machines. So make sure that once you deploy some virtual machines, lock down the firewall rules to only allow your public IP ranges, and also change the default ports for remote management. And of course, all users which have access to the cloud platform should be enabled with multi-factor authentication, because if someone managed to get a hold of your system admin account for Azure, they can basically destroy your entire infrastructure or make some small changes to route traffic in another direction, or install some services or extension inside the virtual machine. The same goes, of course, setting up role-based access control inside the different services. So meaning that help desk should only be allowed to restart a virtual machine and not deploy some new services or create or delete some resources as well. And of course, a little bit what Mike mentioned, you have Azure Monitor, which can be used to monitor the cloud platform itself. Google has something called Stackdriver, which is also supported to monitor infrastructure in AWS. And AWS has something called CloudWatch, which can also monitor the infrastructure platform service itself and notify something is not as it should. So when it comes to comparing the different cloud providers, I want to start a little bit about talking about infrastructure. So this shows you a little bit about the functionality, and you can see while Amazon is still ahead of the game, see that Amazon has a little bit further when it comes to like dedicated instances, bare metal services, and Google doesn't have that same amount of functionality yet. But I'm guessing they'll get to a little bit later. When it comes to like traditional infrastructure and disks, all three vendors support SSDs and different levels. Microsoft announced something called standard SSD a couple of weeks ago. Google has SSD both in terms of remote storage, but they also have local SSD. And Amazon has elastic block storage. And then you have GPU instances. Microsoft has their N series where they support different types of NVIDIA grid cards. So you need to choose the N series virtual machine if you want to have GPU functionality. Google, on the other hand, is more flexible, so which means we can specify a specific virtual machine and just add a GPU to it. We're not bound to any specific instance type. Of course, Amazon has the P2, 3, and G series, which also support NVIDIA cards, but they also announced something called flexible GPU, which is kind of Amazon virtualized GPU. So we just specify the amount of video memory we want attached to any type of virtual machine. When it comes to large instance types, I call them Godzilla VMs. It's pretty much the same now, at the current stage anyway. Both Amazon and Microsoft announced at the SAP conference a couple of weeks ago that they will be releasing up to 12 terabytes of memory on specific virtual machine instances as well. And when it comes to CPU architecture, it's pretty much the same. All of them have different scaling from infrastructure perspective and from a VMware support perspective. Amazon has their own service. Microsoft is coming with it. Google Cloud hasn't said anything yet, but they are working on VMware support through a containerized environment. Any questions so far, by the way, Esther?
I'm keeping track of the questions. The only question we have right now from Salim is you were talking about bare metal, and he was wondering if you were talking about nested configurations or.
Yeah, okay. So with bare metal, I mean that you can actually, you get access to, you set up a server, so you specify what kind of hardware you want. It's running AWS-based hardware, and you get access to a console like HP, Ilio, or a Dell iDRAC, access to one of the AWS servers. So this is the same type of servers that VMware is running on top. So it's not nested. It's basically you get a physical server inside of Amazon's data center.
Okay, so it's more like reserving the compute, but to a machine level.
Yes, correct.
Perfect. And a personal question from me is, you're talking about the Godzilla VMs, but do you see actual usage for those extreme compute machines?
Well, I've been in some projects where they have an old high performance computing application that they're running, which requires large amount of CPU cores in a short term.
Wow.
So I've been using some of the 64 vCPU models to run some statistic workloads. But you know, I haven't encountered anyone running the 128 vCPUs yet, well, in Norway especially.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for explaining that. No other questions right now.
Yeah. So when it comes to migration and backup services, so Mike mentioned a little bit about Azure Backup, and Microsoft, well, they need to focus a lot on the existing on-prem environment as well. So they have different migration services that they have, which is now part of, well, we have Azure Site Recovery, which is basically a DR solution to move or replicate virtual machines from on-prem to cloud, and also from Azure to Azure or from cloud to Azure. So it works in many directions. And of course, we have the Azure Backup, which works for infrastructure in Azure. They also do backup of on-prem environments. And Azure Backup is also, well, Microsoft has something called the System Center Data Protection Manager. And they have a similar function in Azure Backup, so we can use it to do backup of VMware environments. So they basically just changed the logo and removed some functionalities. Google and Amazon, on the other hand, doesn't have the on-prem focus, so they don't have any built-in migration tools to do virtual machine migration. They have some simple services, so we can do VM import, we can upload a disk. Google Cloud has a third-party vendor, which is called Cloud Endure, which can do the migration process for us. But other than that, they don't have the type of feature level that Microsoft has in that area. When it comes to storage services, and here you can see some of the big, the big differences between the three different vendors. So Microsoft has, when it comes to especially data disks, we can have up to 4 terabytes per disk. Operating system disk can be only up to 2 terabytes, but on Google and AWS, we can have from 16 terabytes and up to 64 terabytes with Google Cloud. Of course, the same goes with IOPS and throughput. Google Cloud is basically the Google Cloud platform, and the Google file system. So of course, they have a lot higher throughput than what Microsoft and Amazon has at the moment. Of course, with Google Cloud and Amazon, we can actually customize the IOPS level, so it actually scales with the amount of gigabit or gigabyte storage we actually add. And from a networking file storage perspective, this is why I needed to make some changes, because Google Cloud actually announced yesterday that we're coming with file storage, so it's basically NFS shares to store data inside of Google Cloud, and Amazon has the same with something called EFS, and then Microsoft has something called Azure Files, which is actually SMB-based file share. Microsoft and Amazon also have something called hybrid storage, meaning that we have a virtual appliance which we run on-prem, but allows us to tier data between on-prem and public cloud. So Microsoft has Store Simple. We have also had the file sync. And of course, we also have Amazon, which has the storage gateway as well, which is pretty much the same, but it's pretty much the difference is SMB-based or NFS-based file protocols. When it comes to identity and MDM, Microsoft Azure has Azure Active Directory domain services. So instead of actually spinning up virtual machines and running AD, we can use it as a service. Amazon has something similar called AVS Active Directory. Google doesn't have anything in this area yet. When it comes to SAML-based or web-based identity services, all three vendors have pretty much the same type of functionality when it comes to SAML authentication. They also provide MFA support. They also have functionalities to store secrets, password keys, certificates, and so on. When it comes to more like functionalities across for MDM purposes, it's only Microsoft and Google which has that in part of Intune, and Google MDM, which is part of G Suite, basically. When it comes to networking and security, pretty much the same from a load balancing perspective. Microsoft has many different load balancers available. You have Application Gateway, you have the traditional layer 4 load balancer. Amazon has Elastic Load Balancer, which has a lot more functionality when it comes from a load balancing perspective. And also Google Cloud is pretty much the same when it does load balancing. All three vendors also have different built-in security products or services to actually can check upon your subscription environment to see if there's any misconfigured firewall rules or missing disk encryptions or something happening against your virtual machine or virtual infrastructure as well. And of course, most of the cloud providers also have something now called accelerated networking, meaning that we can have a virtual machine to actually bypass some of the TCP/IP stack from a virtual perspective and go straight down to the physical network card. So SRV-IOV or SRIOV, which is called in Hyper-V. So Microsoft Azure announced or released this a couple of weeks ago or 1 month ago. It's called accelerated networking. And you have also the same functionality in Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services as well. And all three vendors support DNS hosting, which means I can set up a DNS zone and change or add any records there as well. So they deliver as a service. You have direct connectivity, meaning like ExpressRoute or dedicated links directly connected to the different data centers and regions that they have. A difference, on the other hand, is more from a security perspective, is that from a like web application firewall is part of Microsoft Azure Application Gateway. Amazon has their own feature, but in Google Cloud, they have something called Cloud Armor, but that's still in beta. And also now Microsoft recently announced the DDoS Shield as a separate service as well, while Amazon has had that for quite some time already, while Google doesn't have anything in that specific area yet. Now, from a management and automation perspective, I already talked a little bit about the deployment and automation tools. All vendors provide type of CLI tools that we can use to do automation. So it's either using CLI, or we can use PowerShell, or we can use the REST API, or we can use any type of SDK that the different providers have. And of course, from a monitoring and logging tool, as Mike said, more and more is moving from in Azure, specifically moving to Azure Monitor. And we have Stackdriver in Google Cloud, and we have CloudWatch and CloudTrail in Amazon Web Services. And of course, all three vendors provide some form of optimization tool, which basically is like your trusted advisor to say that, hey, you're actually running a virtual machine at it's only using 5% of your capacity, and it can easily then scale down, or say that you can scale down to this specific instance type instead. Now, we also have different automation tools, so which means that we have some form of a workflow engine running inside the different cloud providers to actually make some changes to the infrastructure or do some deployments or stop virtual machines on a specific schedule. So Microsoft has something called Azure Automation, which is based upon PowerShell or desired state configuration files. And Amazon has something called Amazon Cloud Ops, which is based upon Chef, or we can use Puppet as an alternative, which was released a couple of weeks ago. Of course, we can also use any type of third-party configuration management tools. I've already mentioned Terraform, which something that Microsoft is starting to work more and more to integrating into the platform. But we also have Chef, Puppet, Ansible, and SaltStack even. So all these 4 or 5 different vendors now have pretty much good support for all 3 vendors when it comes to automation. So in one of the things we typically use is using Terraform to build all the typical infrastructure, so networking, storage, firewall rules, and so on. And then we have Ansible to actually do a lot of the automation inside of a virtual machine, so installing software components and so on. Now, Terraform also came with a new release yesterday, which also makes it easier to use a lot of the new functionality that Azure provides. And this is one of the drawbacks of using third-party tools, that they always have a release cycle in order to support the latest functionality from each of the different cloud providers. So when it comes from a pricing perspective, I said that Google Cloud is the cheapest in most of my cases that I've been working on. So of course, price differs from region to region, depending on the what kind of generation data center the cloud provider has, and of course, based upon what it costs the provider to actually have a data center stored in that specific region. So I try to compare apples and apples, but it's not always that simple. But here I have a price example running 10 virtual machines either on 10 hours per day or 24/7, or if we have a committed model with 3 years reserved capacity. And all these 3 different examples, see that Google Cloud is the cheapest option. Of course, Microsoft has different licensing agreements that we can use to make it even more cheaper. But just running infrastructure pay as you go, Google Cloud is the cheapest option in most cases that I've encountered. Now, from a storage perspective, so traditional spindle-based storage, slow storage, we see that Microsoft Azure is the cheapest option per gigabyte storage. Now, when it comes to like premium storage, so having SSD-based capacity, Amazon is actually cheapest, but you can also see how it compares in terms of performance with that capacity. So Google has a lot more IOPS and bandwidth, or IOPS and throughput compared to what Microsoft and Amazon has. Now, before I start talking about Citrix in public cloud, any other questions so far?
So far, not a lot of questions. The only question I personally have is regarding your previous statement that Google Cloud is like cheaper in some cases. But I was wondering if you also consider the fact that Google has more limited options from a feature perspective. So is it still like the best bang for the buck?
Yeah, and that depends on what kind of services. I get your question, and it's also depending what kind of services that you want, because like all the different cloud providers have like a huge service catalog, but I might only need to have 2 or 3 services that I might
Yeah,
use.
so it's still a matter of checking what features and what services you need, and then check out which one has the best price.
Yes, so we have some customers that they just want to use one specific service, and they chose Google Cloud because it's the cheapest and it has the best feature parity compared to the others for that specific service.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
So when it comes to running Citrix in public cloud, of course, Citrix Cloud in general has a lot of different service offerings already. You have, of course, the different essentials packages, so Send Desktop Essentials, which is Azure-only services. So like Send Desktop Essentials can only be available through EA agreement or CSP agreement. I'll come back to that a little bit later, why that's the case. But of course, you can use Send Desktop and Send App Service. It is supported to work on any cloud provider, but of course, you lose some functionality. And the same goes with Citrix Workspace Services, which includes all the different services on top. Now, when it comes to a service perspective, like from an automation, so if you want to use MCS, which is the only supported provisioning option in public cloud, MCS is now supported on Microsoft Azure and it's supported on AWS. Now, it's still not supported on Google Cloud, but it was announced that they will be coming with this support later this year. So that's coming. App layering is only supported on Microsoft Azure. Not sure if it's coming on app layering or not. Or coming to Amazon or Google Cloud at a later stage, might be. GPU support is available on Microsoft Azure on the N series. Even though Google Cloud has a lot of GPU options, it's not supported on Google Cloud yet. Amazon Web Services supported to run GPU. Power control, pretty much the same as MCS. It's supported on Azure and AWS, but it's also coming later on Google Cloud because that was announced during Synergy. And Netscaler ADC or VPX and SD-WAN appliances are available on Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services, but they are not available on Google Cloud yet. Of course, for an appliance like Netscaler to be supported in a cloud provider, Citrix needs to certify a specific agent that they need to install inside inside the appliance to allow communication with the underlying cloud platform. So that's a long process that takes a lot of time. But of course, using traditional Netscaler Gateway as a Service is of course supported running on all 3 vendors. There are some things you need to be aware of, is that the Netscaler Gateway as a Service, as of now, 11 12 different points of presence located around the world, but they are spread across Azure and AWS. So from an end user or traffic flow perspective, if you are using Google Cloud as your infrastructure, means that traffic flows from the end user to the Netscaler gateway service, which might be located in the Azure region, and then to the cloud connector running in Google Cloud, and to the VDA, and the same way back again. So might not be an optimal way to route the end user traffic. From an identity perspective, of course, if we want to set up a traditional Citrix environment and set up federated authentication service, we can of course use Azure AD, or we can use Google Identity, or we can use AWS single sign-on mechanism to act as the SAML service provider setup. But of course, Citrix Cloud is now building in more of the identity services on their own. So Citrix Cloud has support for Azure AD from a management perspective, but also from an end user perspective as well. But this is only supported now for Azure AD and not for Google and AWS. Now, of course, there are some licensing things that makes it difficult for others than Microsoft to actually deliver things. So Windows 10, for instance, is one of those things because it's now only supported running on Azure, either through an EA agreement or through a Microsoft CSP agreement if you're using VDA rights. So it's not an option to run that on Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services unless you basically buy dedicated hardware within Amazon to deliver Windows 10 VDI, for instance. Now, of course, RDSH is supported on all three vendors. Of course, there are some licensing stuff that we can use to actually lower the cost for running infrastructure. We can use license mobility on Amazon and Google Cloud. So license mobility works on SQL Server, RDS, and so on. And we also have something called hybrid use benefit, which we can use in Azure as well. Now, from a platform perspective, so instead of actually setting up virtual machine to actually use or instead of setting up virtual machine to run a SQL server, we might be able to use some of the platform services that are available, but it's still not supported in any of the different platforms to use, like SQL as a service. Of course, there are some changes happening there as well. And also Smart Scale, which is one of the tools which is used to scale up and down a virtual infrastructure, is supported on Azure and Amazon, but it's also be coming on Google Cloud as well a little bit later. And also there was some recent announcements made earlier today that Citrix now supports the government region in Microsoft Azure to do provisioning there as well. This was some late change, and of course it is already supported on Amazon Web Services. And Google Cloud doesn't have a specific government region yet, so that's why it doesn't have any support for that yet. Now, when it comes also to running Citrix in public cloud, I see that there's a lot of, specifically built-in service offerings that are specific against Microsoft Azure. So we have the Send Desktop and Send App Essentials, and Citrix released something called Azure Quick Deploy a couple of weeks ago, or 1 week ago, which is also specifically targeted for Microsoft Azure. Of course, Citrix has made a lot of different integrations now with Microsoft and EMS, for instance. So you have the Netscaler and Azure AD integration, which allows the Netscaler to act as type of a network access control component to check if like a Windows 10 device is compliant before they're allowed to gain access. And of course, Microsoft EMS now also has more support for deploying actual VPN profiles directly and natively as well. And Netscaler has up until now had support for auto-scaling backend instances in AWS, so traditional load balancing web servers. So if the Netscaler sees there's a lot of traffic going through and the backend servers can't handle the load, the Netscaler can actually send a command to actually scale up the amount of instances in the backend. And with the 12.1 release, they actually added support for Microsoft Azure as well. But of course, that's for traditional load balancing services. Of course, Citrix Cloud, the backend, is actually using much of the Azure native services. So it's using Service Bus, it's using web apps, blob storage, and infrastructure. So of course, if you are using Microsoft Azure and using Citrix Cloud, from a performance perspective, you might see that it's going to impact the performance in a positive way, that it's makes it easier to communicate because it's using the Microsoft backend network to communicate across instead. And of course, if you are using Office 365, which is actually running on top of Azure, that's also going to affect performance in a good way, that you can have the Office 365 services close to the infrastructure as well. Same goes with Google G Suite. When you're starting to set up the Netscaler or the load balancing components such as SD-WAN and so on, there are some limitations that you need to be aware of. Most of the layer 2 functionality, such as gracious ARP or layer 2 mode and virtual MAC addresses and so on, are not supported in a public cloud because they're using some form of network virtualization underneath, which abstracts away layer 2 functionality. So there are some considerations that we need to make when we're setting up traditionally Netscalers in public cloud. When it comes to support for like Azure Stack and VMware on AWS, Citrix doesn't have any type of provisioning mechanism that works yet. Even though Azure Stack underneath uses much of the same API set, it's not that flexible. So that's why they don't have support for Azure Stack yet, and VMware and AWS doesn't expose the necessary APIs to actually use MCS against that platform. If we want to run Citrix in Google Cloud, as it is today, it's mostly you have a GitHub repository which contains different types of deployment scripts. So this is only if you want to set up a trial or a proof of concept. And these different scripts are made using Cloud Deployment Manager, which is basically created by Google themselves with some good help from other Citrix employees. This runs through the process of actually setting up the necessary infrastructure, so Active Directory, the cloud connectors itself, and then you then go in to set up the Netscaler Gateway as a Service to allow remote access in. So they basically uses something called startup scripts in Deployment Manager to install all the necessary software. And of course, as part of the script, you can specify the amount of workers you want as required as well. But of course, stay tuned for Google has their yearly IT conference next month, 30 days from now actually, which is called .next. So I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of new announcements there as well. Might be that Citrix has an ace up their sleeve coming out there. So stay tuned for that. When it comes to setting up MCS provisioning in Amazon Web Services, of course, I highly recommend that you set up a dedicated IAM user for that to specify what kind of access or what kind of supported features that they need to have access to for the connection itself. I've also seen that if you so if you set up a VPC, you get a default one, you get some default subnets. So the MCS provisioning engine actually uses that to set up a preparation instance before it actually creates the machine catalog. And if you delete the default VPC and default subnet, the MCS machine catalog creation fails. So if you have some difficulties with that piece, you need to go in and recreate the default subnet and default VPC. And of course, if you want to when you want to create a golden image, you need to do the traditional way, setting up, installing VDA, shutting it down. But you need to go into the Amazon console and specify convert it to image, because then it's the only way it's going to be available inside the machine creation process. So when it comes to the Netscaler, it's available as an image inside of the Amazon Marketplace. You have different subscriptions or different levels of what kind of bandwidth you need to have. Of course, setting up Netscaler in AWS, you have the same layer 2 issues that you have on Azure when it comes to high availability and failover processes. So you need to be aware of that. In order to actually set up high availability in Amazon, you need to deploy 2 virtual instances within the same availability zone, so you don't have that flexibility of migrating between availability zones. But you have something called Elastic Network Interface, which is then going to be migrated from one appliance to another in case of a high availability failover. I actually also got support or feedback earlier today that Amazon RDS, I said that platform services are not supported, but AWS RDS, which is basically a SQL Server as a service, is now Citrix Ready verified. And the same goes with the Amazon AD service. So instead of setting up virtual instances running Active Directory, you can actually use the built-in service from Amazon. Now, I have a little bit more on Azure side of things, because especially now that we're seeing a lot more focus on Azure, especially here or in my projects anyway. See, there's a huge when it comes to choosing what kind of virtual machine instance you want to have. I see that the V2 series and the F series are by far the most typically used virtual machine instance types. Of course, when you're trying to set up the identity piece, you might be choosing the Azure Active Directory domain services, because instead of setting up virtual machine instances yourself, you can use it as a service. Of course, it doesn't work in a hybrid model because you can't set up AD sites and subnets, so it means that traffic is not going to flow in a good way between the different regions. Of course, you need to set up availability sets. This is going to change to be more using availability zones in the future. Now supported to use managed disks inside the MCS, so which means that we avoid the historically IOPS limit that we have had on classic disks and storage accounts previously. When you are setting up virtual machines, which is not MCS based, so when you set up storefront, delivery controllers, Active Directory, make sure that you use the accelerated networking feature inside of Azure, because that's going to be allowing you for higher throughput and lower CPU usage when you have cross communication. So it's available now as part of a template or as part of the portal itself, but it's not supported yet on Citrix Netscaler. I haven't gotten it verified yet, and it's also not available in the MCS wizard creating the catalog creation process. And of course, if you are using Azure Backup for deploying or backupping your virtual machines in Azure, there's also a button inside of Azure Backup which allows you to upgrade the Azure Backup service to use the latest feature. So that's a manual process. It's not available yet from an automation perspective, but this allows Azure Backup to actually take backup and snapshots faster. So they actually haven't been able to figure that out yet to make it automation-wise. So if you want to set up GPU in Azure, use the NV series. It comes with a grid license included for workstation. The problem I have with N series is that it provides an SSD disk, but it's only for the temp drive. It's not for the operating system or any data disks that you might have if you choose the N series with the M60 card specifically.
And you also need to check out the specific drivers, because you need to install the NVIDIA drivers to get the grid license in Azure. Yes, correct. So Microsoft has the grid driver available on the documentation site, which also includes the license. Thank you for highlighting that. The MCS provisioning, the catalog process creates its own resource group, or you can choose to specify a custom resource group. Don't touch that resource group because it will break the connection between the MCS connection between your Azure subscription. And of course, if you want to set up any type of backup of your golden image, you can use tools like AZCopy, which is like RoboCopy, but for Azure, or you can use Azure Storage Explorer to actually copy out an image from one storage account to another, or from a managed disk account to another. And you can also combine Microsoft Azure with if you have a Windows 10 deployment and you want to use Azure Active Directory as an identity and you want to run Citrix in Azure. You can also combine this with Citrix Federated Authentication Service. So I've written a blog post about that to actually have a full single sign-on from Windows 10 Azure AD into a Citrix environment. Those are some of the functionalities that you have there. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because the same requirements to actually deploying Netscaler in Azure. If you are, however, doing automation of Netscaler in Azure, you want to deploy the Netscaler from the marketplace, you actually need to accept the marketplace terms from Azure. And that's, of course, available through a PowerShell command, which I've added further down here. So you need to run this before you actually do the deployment of Netscaler from the marketplace using templates.
So it's a little bit funny that you need to have this up and running. And of course, if you want to have failover functionality in Azure, you need to have an Azure load balancer in front of the Netscaler to actually handle the failover process, because we don't have reverse ARP features available to handle the failover. And when you are setting up HA, of course, there are ARM templates available for just deploying Netscaler, but you need to set up the HA with INC, so independent network configuration, available to make that work properly. And of course, Smart Scale allows now to scale up and down instances on demand. So this is now supported for Amazon, and Azure is coming for Google a bit later. If you are using Citrix Cloud, this service is already integrated. If you are using traditional Citrix, you need to install an on-prem agent to communicate with your delivery controller to define these different rules. Of course, we can specify a schedule. We can specify a schedule if you want to have virtual instances to start on a specific time, or we can specify based upon load the amount of sessions, or we can combine between the two. So I'm running out of time. I see a couple of minutes more. When it comes to building master images in the different cloud providers, of course, all 3 different cloud providers have their own built-in automation layer to build infrastructure. But what I typically use now is something called Packer, which is from the same guys that create Terraform. It's actually a building image component. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example script. I've shorted it out a little bit so it fits into the presentation, but it's actually building up a Windows server in Azure of specific location, specific size, and then we have provisioners which actually run scripts inside of the virtual machine before it actually does sysprep and quits out. And then we when the process is done, I have an image that I can use for the MCS process. And of course, we're also seeing now third-party tools which also come with their own support for public cloud. So FS Logic announced the Cloud Cache component that they're coming with, which will be coming with support for Azure and AWS and Google later on. And we have Liquidware, which has also support for some support for storing stuff within the different cloud providers and from a storage perspective. And you also have ControlUp, which also has support for monitoring AWS infrastructure as well. I was trying to find any other third-party tools here, but I didn't have the time to get information, but I'm guessing there's a lot more coming in this space as well. Now, from a summary perspective, I see that Microsoft and Citrix now has the most built-in functionality. Now, of course, Citrix Cloud has a lot of focus on Microsoft Azure. Of course, much of the backbone in Citrix Cloud is also running there in Microsoft Azure. And if you have VDI and Office 365, Azure is it's the only logical choice. And of course, with the combination of EMS, it also makes it quite an attractive cloud to actually deploy Citrix in. Amazon Web Services, even though there has been support for quite some time, there hasn't been a lot of recent development. And of course, the documentation is quite behind when it comes to the latest versions of Citrix and also Citrix Cloud. Now, Google, which I hope is probably going to be the next big platform for Citrix moving forward. Of course, they announced a lot of new services that are going to be available now 90 days after Synergy. So I'm just counting down the days. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. So any other questions?
Yes, I had a couple of questions from Magnus regarding the Citrix Workspace service. Do you know which one is the most up-to-date? And when the Workspace app, which was announced at Synergy, is probably going to go live?
Yeah, so my guess there is that the Workspace app, which was announced at Synergy, so Citrix has 90 days to get it out as well. I think it was either a tech preview or beta. So I'm guessing
that's what I heard too.
Yeah, so 3 months from 1 month ago, so they have 2 months to go. Of course, Citrix Workspace, what is the most up to date? So Citrix Cloud is always being so Citrix is using a type of DevOps way to actually update their backend. So Citrix Cloud is always up to date on the latest version. So from Citrix workspace perspective, they're always doing deployments every 14 days to every of their cloud components that they have. Of course, what we're seeing is that like Azure Quick Deploy, which is a new service or function that Citrix released, is now instead of using Citrix Studio to do management, they actually have a web-based UI front end to actually do the deployment. So it might be that it's, of course, that has some other additional components that requires updating as well. But I think that in general, most of the Citrix Cloud super services are following the same development rate.
Okay, and another question I had from Jamie, if I pronounce it correctly, is if Citrix now supports the Microsoft Azure database service, and I think that's Azure SQL, for storing your XenApp and XenDesktop site databases. As he stated, they have that for AWS. So
yeah, the answer is no. It's not supported yet. Microsoft is actually releasing something called, so if you compare SQL Server to Azure SQL, it's quite similar, but it's still not the same. It's not a traditional Windows SQL Server as it is, but Microsoft is actually releasing something called Managed SQL Instances, which is coming out later this year, and it's actually a managed SQL server, so a traditional Windows server, but managed by Microsoft. And I'm guessing that's going to be supported by Citrix quite soon after they release it, because, well, it's a traditional SQL server, so it's pretty much the same as what Amazon has in the RDS space.
okay, so that's something we need to keep an eye out.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, those are the most important questions that I tagged. I think we did our best to answer some of the others that came up, or some tips and tricks. So thank you very much for your time and the great explanations, Marius.
Yeah, and thank you for your help. And thank you for everyone that was listening.
Yes, thank you, Marius. I just have a couple of housekeeping details before everyone runs off, so don't leave just yet. I have a quick link. Uh-oh, my PowerPoint quit on me again. Just a moment. Actually, Esther, while I'm getting my PowerPoint up, I think I saw something else come in really quickly if you want to ask Marius one more.
Yes, I had to check the question. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Marius, there's one more question that Evan is asking. He says, or he's asking, are there any concerns using an on-prem Citrix infrastructures where the VDIs are running in Azure? So do you have any experience with a setup like that?
Yeah, well, we have had some projects in that specific area, but it also always depends on how we want the traffic to flow. Do you want the end users traffic to go through like the on-prem environment to your firewall and then through a site-to-site VPN and up to Azure? Or do you want to have any end users to directly connect to the public cloud natively and still having some stuff running on-prem? Of course, the big issue that I have is, of course, if you want to set up like a hybrid mode, you have something running on-prem, you have something running in cloud. And well, especially for us in Norway, where we have a lot of, well, the closest regions for Azure is a lot of kilometers away. So of course, latency is always an issue. So I'm guessing it depends on how you want the traffic to flow, but latency is one of those things. And of course, how you will handle application communication across the different environments.
Thanks, I think that answered it, and I hope that gave Stephanie enough time to find the PowerPoint.
I did. Hopefully you guys can see it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marius. Thank you, Esther. I'm glad that your Wi-Fi held out for you and you're able to stay on with us today. And thank you, DJ, for staying there and being on standby in case Esther had any connectivity troubles. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And so before everyone goes, I put a link in the chat window for you to a survey. It's short and anonymous, and it's for us only at CUGC. And we just love to get your ideas. We like to get your feedback. We always like to hear about any ideas you have for future webinars and how we're doing things. So please fill it out. It's very quick. And just a reminder that I know some of you are hoping to get a Yeti cooler and Yeti coasters. If you don't know what the Yeti coasters are, they are awesome. They are stainless steel. They keep your drink cold for hours. They're amazing. So we will announce the winner of that package on Twitter and on mycugc.org, which brings me to my next point, to make sure you follow us on Twitter at mycugc. We have a lot of announcements we throw out there for local meetings, upcoming webinars, blog posts, everything. So please follow us on Twitter. And if you are not a member of myCUGC, please come out to the site, sign up, find your local group, and get plugged in. There are local events happening all the time. So we hope to see you at one of those. And I think that's it. Thank you so much. We had a great set of sessions today, lots of great information. You'll be getting an email either tomorrow or Friday, depending on how long it takes us to process all the videos, but you'll get a link to the recordings and to the slide decks, and also to a forum thread on the website, so you can ask more questions if you need to. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you again to those of you who are still here, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.